This presentation is about obesity and hypertrophy and the effects that genetics have on them. I'm going to start out talking generally about obesity and then talk about the articles I found with evidence that genetics do play a role in being obese or overweight. After, I'm going to talk a little about the different types of hypertrophy and how genetics have the ability to affect them as well. Before I get started on any of this, I want to include a little video and a brief description of what genes are.
What exactly is a gene? Each one of our cells contains 46 strands of DNA. A single strand is made of millions of particles called nucleotides, and these nucleotides come in 4 different types, which scientists have labeled A, C, T, and G. A gene is a special stretch of DNA, a sequence of A's, C's, T's, and G's that code for something. A gene contains information for a cell to read and use, but what exactly does that information do? You might have heard that there's a blue-eyed gene, a freckle gene, possibly even an anger gene, but single genes don't literally make things like eyeballs or freckles or temper tantrums. Genes make proteins. Those proteins then interact with each other and all sorts of chemicals inside the body to build things like eye pigments, freckles, and mood-altering hormones. A single strand of DNA contains thousands of genes or unique protein recipes. Humans have roughly 20,000 altogether. Some genes are small, only about 300 letters long. Others are well over 1 million. The length and sequence of a gene determine the size and shape of the protein it builds. The size and shape of the protein determine the function that protein will have inside the body. Hemoglobin, for example, is a protein structure found in red blood cells. Its unique shape and size allow it to capture oxygen molecules when blood flows near the lungs, and then release them later when blood flows near oxygen-starved tissues. Pepsin is a digestive protein. Its unique shape allows it to break down food inside your stomach so it can be absorbed by the body. Keratin is a structural protein. Its unique shape and size allow it to link together with other keratin proteins to form hard structures like fingernails, claws, and beaks. Different creatures have different genes, which is ultimately why their bodies look and function differently. But one of the many reasons scientists believe all life on Earth is related is that the basic DNA code, the language of A's, C's, T's, and G's, is pretty much the same for all living things. Many creatures even share some of the same genes. You might not be too surprised to learn that humans and chimps, which are closely related, share 96% of their genetic code. But what would you think a lowly fruit fly has in common with a beautiful swimsuit model? Surprisingly, about half of its genes. Because all creatures use DNA in pretty much the same way, genetic engineers have found that if they take a gene from, say, a bacteria cell and insert it into the DNA of an animal or a plant cell, that animal or plant cell will then read the new gene and produce the bacterial protein. Engineers have mixed and matched the genes of different organisms to produce many new creatures, including corn that is toxic to insects but supposedly safe for human consumption, tomatoes that last up to twice as long in the grocery store before going bad, and a new form of bacteria that produce the human protein insulin, which we then collect from these bacteria and give to people with diabetes who need extra insulin to survive. So just to sum things up a bit, what exactly is a gene? A gene is a special stretch of DNA, not the entire strand of DNA, just a segment that codes for something. Each gene is like a unique recipe, which usually tells a cell how to make a protein or a group of proteins. Different creatures have different genes, but all genes are written in the same basic DNA language of A's, C's, T's, and G's. I'm John Perry, and that's genes stated clearly.
Okay, so here are a few statistics about obesity. More than 2/3, or 68.8% of adults, are considered to be overweight or obese. More than one-third, or 35.7% of adults, are considered to be obese. More than 1 in 20, or 6.3%, have extreme obesity. Almost 3 in 4 men, or 74%, are considered to be overweight or obese. But how is obesity defined or measured? Obesity can be defined as someone that is overweight or having excessive body fat. In other words, weight that is higher than what is considered as a healthy weight for a given height is described as obese. The body mass index, or BMI, is used as a screening tool for overweight or obesity. It is defined as a person's weight in kilograms divided by the square of its height in meters. If your BMI is less than 18.5, it falls within the underweight range. If your BMI is 18.5 to 24.9, it falls within the normal or healthy weight range. If your BMI is 25 to 29.9, it falls in the overweight range. If your BMI is 30 or higher, it falls within the obese range. Here's kind of an example of a BMI chart with someone with a height of 5'9". If that person of 5'9" is 124 pounds or less, they're below the 18.5 mark, which makes them underweight. If they're between 125 and 168, it puts them between the 18.5 to 24.9, which means that they're a healthy weight. If they weigh 169 to 202 pounds, that puts them between the 2.5 to 29.9 on the BMI chart, which makes them overweight. And if they're 203 pounds or more, that puts them to 30 or higher, which means they are obese. Most people would argue that being overweight comes from choices made by people and not controlling what or lack of exercise, and that's it, which is true, but not all the way true. In reality, there are many causes for obesity, including some of the following. Stress, medication, unhealthy foods, and even just getting older can cause it. The lack of energy balance most often causes overweight and obesity. Energy balance means that your energy in equals your energy out. Energy in is the amount of energy or calories you're getting from food and drinks. Energy out is the amount of energy your body uses for things like breathing, digesting, and being physically active. To maintain a healthy weight, your energy in and out must be balanced over a period of time. People that overeat and do not exercise over a period of time have more energy in and energy out, causing them to gain weight. Scientists are now finding research that genetics might also play a role in obesity. Before I talk about the different articles that I found, here's a short video with a little bit on some research on genetics and obesity.
When we started this study, what we were interested in is trying to figure out what predisposes people to becoming obese. Certainly when you look at our current population, there are some people that are more obese than others, and there's a whole range of that. And we knew from previous studies that some of that was genetically predisposed. And to do this effectively, what we had to do is really bring together groups that could give us population-based data on people that have measures of obesity measured, and also that have been genotyped or assayed for different changes in their genetic structure, so that we can find genetic changes that correlate with people becoming more obese and developing metabolic disease. More than 100 groups around the world came together in a consortium called the Genetics of Anthropometric Traits Consortium. And we got a working group together to pull the data and then look to find specific regions of the genome that are associated with these conditions. And from that, as we put the data together, variants came out that were reproducibly associated with these traits, suggesting that they're real. And these variants were near genes that told us a little bit about the biological predisposition to obesity. We found 97 different regions of the genome that were associated with increased body mass index. And from these, we are able to sort of look near these areas and look at some of the genes that are in there and figure out what are the kinds of processes that may be related to predisposing people to obesity. Surprisingly, when we started off working on obesity, it's a metabolic condition, and so we were looking for metabolic processes, metabolic genes. But interestingly, one of the things we came across is that a lot of the genes, or some of the areas that we were landing in, actually played a role in sort of neuronal processes. And some of these neuronal processes that some of these genes play in make sense in retrospect. Some of them play a role in controlling appetite, but then some of them seem to play a role in energy expenditure, in physical activity, Some of them seem to play very basic roles in how neurons talk to each other or signal from one another. And so really that opens up a whole new area of understanding for what causes people to be predisposed to having higher obesity and higher rates of these other related metabolic diseases that we really weren't expecting. It was really very exciting to us as new ways to potentially understand this disease so we can do something about it. Obesity correlates with a lot of other metabolic diseases, such as higher rates of diabetes, higher rates of cardiovascular disease, higher rates of cholesterol problems, higher rates of blood pressure problems. And we also found variants that not only affected body mass index, but also affected these other traits. As people become obese, some people stay healthy. Some people develop these metabolic diseases, and we don't really know why that is. And when they do develop these diseases, some people develop different sets of them. Some people are obese and have diabetes. Some people are obese and get heart disease. But now we are starting to find sort of genetic variants that predispose people to not only obesity, but some of these other metabolic diseases. So that's starting to get to a better understanding of, how this causes disease. You're defining the variants and then the genes that sort of underlie a predisposition to metabolic disease in general. So in the future, we may be able to subcategorize people into those that will sort of develop healthy obesity versus the ones that are going to get the other metabolic complications of obesity, again, so that we can better tailor their care in the future. One of the things that becomes very evident from our work is that there's a lot of different causes of obesity, and in particular that affect body mass index. We have 97 different regions of the genome that associate with this trait. So if people were waiting for one thing to come out of this that causes obesity so that we could cure it, that's not really what this condition is all about. We hope that we can look at you and sort of give you a better sense of, well, if you gain weight, you may develop obesity, but you won't develop any other diseases, or you will become obese and be very at high risk of developing diabetes or cardiovascular disease, and sort of be able to subclassify people into what really caused you to get to this point and to have this diseases versus the person next to you.
They started to test this theory by prisoner feeding experiments conducted by the University of Vermont researcher Ethan Sims. Sims fed inmates at the Vermont State Prison upward to 10,000 calories per day. With over 200 days of overfeeding them, 20 inmates gained an average of 20 to 25 pounds. The men had difficulty maintaining weight gain, and most shed all of the weight they had gained relatively easily once their caloric intake returned to normal. The exceptions were 2 inmates who gained weight but then struggled to lose the weight even after caloric consumption was reduced. That both these men had family histories of obesity added empirical support to the idea that obesity could be hereditary. Next experiment was performed by Stunkard and his colleagues. Stunkard and his colleagues used a Danish adoption registry of 540 adults, the majority of whom had been adopted by the age of 1. All adults included in the study had adoption records that included the height and weight of their biological and adoptive parents. When comparing the data and the BMI of the adopted adults, they found that despite having shared an environment with their adoptive parents, the adoptees' body mass index were closer to their biological parents rather than the adoptive parents. The study showed that 4/5 of those with 2 obese biological parents were obese, as compared to 1/7 of those with normal weight biological parents. 4 years later, Stunkard and another team of research used another twin registry, this time from Sweden, to further their research about genetics and obesity. The research included 247 pairs of identical twins, 154 pairs that had been raised together, and 93 pairs that had been adopted by different parents. The identical twins, it turned out, had virtually the same weight regardless of whether they had grown up together or separately. As found in another article, when the twins were overfed on a set schedule, giving the same amount of calories a day, although the weight of the different sets of twins varied, within the set the twins stayed within the same weight and BMI. The article then talked about how in 2007, Mark McCarthy, Andrew Hartsley, and their colleagues in the United Kingdom identified a common variant in FTO, the fat mass and obesity associated gene. These studies, of course, reinforce that some physicians, researchers have insisting on for more than a century, that obesity is innate and the weight regulation is not governed by an uniform tally of calorie in, calorie out, and to quote Jules, that there is a biochemical and basic biological element in what we call willpower. The views of many Americans, notwithstanding weight, is clearly far from being entirely within the individual's control. Genetic preposition in tandem with the development of food environment that facilitating overeating and building environment requiring minimal energy expenditure may help explain why so many Americans are obese today. The next article I found had two separate papers published in the Journal of Science and the Journal of Clinical Investigations, or the JCI. Research described new genetic factors that could explain weight gain in some people. In the science study, researchers at the Boston Children's Hospital studying mice found a rare genetic mutation that prevented the animals from burning off fat calories. They also found the same gene was mutated in a group of obese people. And a team based out of the University College of London reported in the JCI that a specific form of the gene previously linked to obesity can increase craving for high-fat foods. Discovery added to the growing body of knowledge in the biological behind weight, and the results confirm that while it's represented by a single number, weight is a complex combination of a multitude of different metabolic processes, from brain systems that regulate appetite to enzymes that control how efficiently calories are turned from food to energy that the body needs. Making matters even more confusing, these factors are also likely influenced by environmental contributors such as diet and lifestyle. In the mouse study, the research team determined that mutations of the MRAP2 gene led the animal to eat less initially but still gain about twice as much weight as the normal would. While their appetites returned, these mice continued to gain weight despite being fed the same number of calories as a group of controlled animals. That led the scientists to figure out that the mice with the mutated gene were simply seizing fat rather than breaking it down for energy. The mice, like people, possessed two copies of the gene, and the mice with even one defective copy experienced significant weight gain, although not as much as those who had two mutated versions of the MRAP2. The scientists found a similar pattern among a group of 500 obese people. They detected four mutations in the human version of the MRAP2, and each of these obese individuals possessed only one bad version of the gene. Dr. Joseph, after the study, said, "Thus far, mutations in about 8 genes are known to cause obesity in humans. But these mutations account for under 5% of the obesity in our society and certainly are not by themselves responsible for current obesity epidemic, since the mutation is rare and these genes could not have changed dramatically during the past 20 years." In two contemporary gene studies in 2007, two researchers, alongside their teams, identified the fat mass and obesity-associated gene as highly significantly related to body mass index and waist circumference. In 2008, two studies identified the MC4R, previously known to be important in monogenetic forms of obesity, as playing a role in common forms of obesity as well. 2009 was quite a banner year for genetics of common complex obesity, with an additional 6 published genetic studies reporting 14 new loci for body fat traits. But the scientific explanation behind many of these variants remain unknown, as do the actual functional variants. Many of the discovery candidates located near genes that are highly expressed in the brain and hypothalamus suggest a role for neutral control in body weight regulation. For example, the study uncovered a new gene influencing waist circumferences, known as the NRXN3 gene, which has previously implicated in studies of addiction and reward behavior. However, statistically, these variants explain only a small portion of the underlying genetic variation in body fat. In order to better understand this, much more research is going to have to be conducted. Like obesity, the development of metabolic risk factors is likely to involve both genetic and environmental components. Serum lipid levels, components of the metabolic syndrome, are highly genetic. Studies of related components of the metabolic syndrome include blood lipids, blood pressure, and blood glucose insulin levels. Further studies have investigated the co-occurrence of risk factors and found evidence that one gene may affect another gene and could be the underlying for clustering. Results from a number of gene tests provide further evidence of common genetic effects on multiple components of the metabolic syndrome.
When you're obese, it's difficult to ambulate. Your body suffers from the weight, pain in your knees. When you eat grease, your arteries begin to fail. You get the profile of a whale, and sex starts to cease. You wonder when your life will end from heart attack or stroke or diabetes. When you're obese, despite the pleas from doctors, friends, and family, you can't reduce so easily. Please pass the cheese. It's empirical when you're spherical that it would be a miracle to fish out your genitals from a crease when you're obese.
New research has shown that children's genes are more important than the environment in determining whether they will become obese. In a study that included more than 5,000 identical and non-identical twin pairs, researchers found heredity to be a much bigger cause of childhood obesity than lifestyle. They concluded that 3/4 of a child's risk for becoming overweight is due to genetic influence, while just under a quarter of a risk can be attributed to environment. Research Susan Carnell says the fact that genes play such an important role in childhood weight is somewhat surprising. The obesity rate among children in the U.S. has more than doubled for preschoolers and teens over the past 3 decades, and more than tripled for children between the ages of 6 and 11, according to CDC. Carnell and colleagues studied twins in an effort to quantify the impact of genetics and environmental influences. The reason they chose twin studies was because they believed that twin studies provide a unique method for disentangling nature and nurture by taking advantage of the fact that identical twins share all of their genes, whereas fraternal twins on average share half of their segregating genes. A total of 5,092 identical and non-identical twin pairs were enrolled in a large ongoing trial took part in the study. The participants were born between 1994 and 1996. Researchers measured each child's body mass index, or BMI, and waist circumference, and then compared the findings between the identical and non-identical twins. Using a standard genetic modeling analysis, the researchers concluded that the difference in the children's BMI and waist circumference were 77% attributable to genes. The study appears in the latest issue of the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. The findings do not mean that becoming overweight or obese is inevitable for children who are genetically susceptible, but it does mean that these children may need to have more precautions. The article talked about how there is a strange gene that makes it harder for people to resist food. They have a tendency to crave unhealthy foods, and if they give in to the cravings too frequently, they gain weight. This is especially hard in children because they do not have as much willpower as the adults have accumulated. Although they did find evidence of genes affecting weight, even the research doesn't believe that genes are 100% the cause. The researchers stated, this type of genetic predisposition cannot be expressed if there wasn't so much food around. She says, we would all be skinny. It is our environment that is allowing our genetic susceptibility to express itself. It would benefit everyone if we did more as a society to encourage activity and healthy eating, but it would be especially beneficial for children who are highly susceptible to their environment. Overall, I agree with genes playing a role in obesity for some people. I do not believe this to be true in all cases, though. It is inevitable that anyone that has more energy in than more energy out is going to gain weight, and environmental factors are going to affect people. However, taking into account that people possess a gene that could cause them to gain weight would explain metabolic rates in people gaining weight faster given the same caloric intake as someone else. Also, how people lose weight faster when on diets and working out, giving the same caloric intake as another person. This also explains why some people crave more foods than other people. I also believe that genetic plays more of a role in children in being obese than in adults. Children have not experienced the environmental factors as adults have, and when they are obese, it is more likely to come from the genes than in adults. Now moving on to the topic of hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is defined as the enlargement of an organ or tissue from the increase in size of its cells. There are different types of hypertrophy, which include muscular hypertrophy, cardiac hypertrophy, and more specifically, left ventricular hypertrophy, which I'm going to explain in more detail and cover in the rest of this PowerPoint.
Fascination with muscles and strength, whether we want to be stronger, feel better, or look like Superman. And there are many proposed strategies and exercise regimens to get this done. But what if I told you that it was out of your control and that your genetics may be entirely holding you back? Conversely, what if there was a secret out there that could lead you to superhuman strength? The truth is, your muscle size has a limit. Sure, it may seem obvious when you hear it, but your muscles are under the strict control of a protein called myostatin, which determines exactly how large a muscle can become. And this limit is different for everyone depending on their myostatin levels. As a muscle reaches this limit, myostatin prevents any further growth. But if the myostatin itself is limited or absent, this muscle limit suddenly goes away. This phenomenon was first noticed in Belgian blue cattle. These cows developed 2 to 3 times more muscle mass than a normal cow, and it was later discovered that they had a deletion of their gene GDF8, which just so happens to create myostatin. As a result, without any exercise or special diet, these cows have incredible muscle mass. Similar cases have been documented in some dogs, mice, and even a few cases of human babies lacking the GDF8 gene. These findings have helped scientists understand why some people bulk up easily while others struggle to. Lower levels of myostatin equals more muscle mass. In fact, some studies have even showed that many champion bodybuilders have naturally lower levels or even entire deletions of their myostatin gene. If you look at somebody like Arnold Schwarzenegger, as a teen he just looks naturally muscular. As such, perhaps many champion bodybuilders owe their success more to genetics than to training or drug use. Eventually, it may be possible to develop drugs which deplete or block myostatin. Of course, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, patients with muscular dystrophy or muscle loss from aging could regrow and restore muscle. On the other hand, the potential for abuse as performance enhancers seems inevitable. But the prospect of seeing a real-life human Hulk seems kinda cool. Besides, should those who already have low levels of myostatin be considered to have an unfair advantage? It's hard to say. Regardless, be wary of anybody selling or promoting this unproven and unregulated treatment. At the end of the day, whether you have naturally low or high myostatin levels, remember, this is the level that is optimal for your mechanical and metabolic efficiency. With proper exercise and general health, you'll reach your own unique physiological peak. And while you may not be destined to pack a punch like Superman, you can push your own limits through training and hard work. But what if you could punch as hard as Superman? Our friend Jake over at Vsauce3 has the answer to this smashing superhero question, which you definitely need to check out. And if you want to know how much myostatin you have, there's only one real way to find out. Get working.
Now moving on to the topic of hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is defined as the enlargement of an organ. Okay, so this slide is about muscular hypertrophy. As the video talked about, muscle hypertrophy is when there is an increase in muscle mass in cross-sectional areas. The increase in dimension is due to an increase in the size of the individual muscle fibers. This can be a result of working out or a genetic makeup. While researching about it, I found an interesting story about people who are born with abnormal strength. These are extreme cases of muscle hypertrophy and are extremely rare. At 5 months old, Liam of Grand Prairie Rapids, Michigan, started doing an experienced gymnastic move called the Iron Cross. By 8 months old, Liam could do a pull-up, and by 9 months, he could climb up and down the stairs. Soon the family thought to take him to a specialist who diagnosed Liam with a rare condition loosely called myosin-related muscle hypertrophy. Many substances in the body can control muscle growth, but in 1997, Johns Hopkins University researchers discovered a gene and a protein called myosin. first in mice, then in a breed of muscular cattle called the Belgian Blue. Wells explained that virtually every animal on Earth has a gene that produces a muscle-growing, inhibiting protein called myostatin. High levels of myostatin make it harder for the body to build muscle, and low levels of myostatin allow muscles to grow. After the mice and cattle discovery, scientists found natural mutations in some dogs, sheep, but never in a human until 2004. In 2004, researchers found a German boy was born with a defective myostatin gene and showed super strength that surpassed Liam's, who had a functional gene but an unspecified difficulty regulating myostatin. Lee said he has heard of several attempts to use antibodies and other means to block the myostatin gene for the purpose of treating muscular dystrophy. But the researchers he followed researched at the Biotin Company in California, Johns Hopkins University, and the company in Massachusetts. They said he has yet to hear of a success. It hasn't been documented that if you give myostatin blockers that you could get muscle to grow, he said, because of the genetic makeup he produces so low, if any at all, myostatin. The researchers and development is so new, he may also show doctors a long-term effect of the super strength.
About left ventricular hypertrophy. What is it?
It's an increase in left ventricular weight. It shows up as high voltage on the ECG, with this T-segment changes.
Although this isn't very sensitive, the ECG changes are found only about 1/3 of the time.
Most people use echo. There are various methods for estimating LV mass. They're quite accurate if you have adequate images.
But remember to index these measurements to body size.
Especially height, and height squared.
What if I index to body surface area?
Body surface area increases with body weight. So if you index to it, you'll tend to overlook obesity as a contributor.
You may get a near normal result in shorter, fatter people even when hypertrophy is present.
All right. So why does hypertrophy develop?
It's a response to unusual hemodynamic load to normalize wall stress. This more or less follows the law of Laplace. Stress is higher when the cavity pressure or volume is increased, or when the wall is thin.
What's the difference between concentric and eccentric hypertrophy?
They are different patterns of response, varying with the type of load imposed on the heart.
Concentric hypertrophy develops with a pressure load such as systemic hypertension or aortic valve stenosis. Myocytes enlarge in parallel, the wall thickens and the LV cavity may get smaller.
Okay.
Eccentric hypertrophy follows a volume load such as chronic aortic or mitral valve incompetence. Myocytes enlarge in series. The wall thickness doesn't change much, but the LV cavity enlarges.
What about hypertrophic cardiomyopathy?
That'll have to be another lesson.
And LV hypertrophy that develops in athletes.
That's really interesting. The signaling pathways to hypertrophy are different in healthy athletes to those in a disease state. If you do experiments on mice, under pressure or volume overload, they develop hypertrophy and heart failure. But if you switch on the pathways which usually only activate in athletes, they live longer.
I wonder why the mice didn't do that in the first place.
So do I.
Maybe they don't like exercise.
Okay, so now moving on to cardiac and left ventricle hypertrophy. As the video stated, cardiac hypertrophy is a thickening of the heart muscle, which results in a decrease in size of the chambers of the heart, including the left and right ventricles. A common cause of cardiac hypertrophy is high blood pressure and heart valve stenosis. Cardiac hypertrophy is more common in the left ventricle. Left ventricle hypertrophy is a condition in which the muscle walls of the heart's left pumping chamber becomes thickened. Other conditions such as heart attack, valve disease, and dilated cardiomyopathy can cause the heart to get bigger. Left ventricle hypertrophy follows two genetic patterns of concentric and eccentric hypertrophy. Concentric hypertrophy is characterized by an increase in wall thickness, whereas the left ventricle cavity is smaller or normal in size. In contrast, in eccentric hypertrophy, The major increase is in the left ventricle chamber size, with mild or no increase to wall thickness. In concentric hypertrophy, the main increase is in the cell width because of the addition of muscles and similar. Cardiac hypertrophy is a complex phenotype, hence its expression is determined by the complex interaction of various genetic and non-genetic factors. The contributions of each component to the phenotype is complex dependent. In the so-called pure form, the cardiac hypertrophy, the contribution of genetic factors is experienced to outweigh that of the non-genetic factors. Left ventricle hypertrophy is known as a phenotype because it can be changed due to the genetic makeup and mutation in the genes. In my research, I found articles that had supported that there are certain genes that contribute to the development of left ventricle hypertrophy. Genes that encode components of hormonal pathways, genes of key sympathetic and parasympathetic receptors, genes that modify intracellular ion homeostasis, genes that modify each metabolism, genes that modify motor units, compositions, and regulations, all are genetic factors. These genetic factors can be passed down from family members. Although there are other outside factors such as age, weight, and sex, genetics still play a role. In conclusion, I do believe genes play a role in hypertrophy and obesity. Although it does not account for all reasons why people are obese or have hypertrophy because there are external and environmental factors, it does help explain some cases and even rare cases, such as the case talked about in muscular hypertrophy. Because myostatin is a genetic makeup, producing more or less comes from genes. It is said that during research they have found that most bodybuilders produce low levels of myostatin, explaining why they can increase muscle mass so well. Left ventricle hypertrophy is not only affected by genes, but also obesity, which in turn could be due to some genes according to the beginning of my research, making this one big circle. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and I look forward to hearing and reading your responses.
Big girl, you are beautiful. Walks into the room, feels like a big balloon. Said, hey girls, you are beautiful. Diet Coke and a pizza, please. Diet Coke, I'm on my knees screaming, big girl, you are beautiful. You take your skinny girl, I feel like I'm gonna die. Cause a real woman needs a real man, here's why. You take your girl and multiply her by 4. Now a whole lot of woman needs a whole lot more. Get yourself to the butterfly lounge, find yourself a big lady. Big boy, come on around and they'll be gonna do, baby. No need to fantasize since I was in my braces. Water in a hole with the girls around and curves in all the right places.